Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, so you never miss a story.
What if the man who preached love, kindness, and faith to an entire town was hiding a horrific secret behind the closed doors of his own home? Pastor Samuel Carter, beloved by all, was a pillar of his community, until his children, shattered by years of abuse, finally found the courage to speak. What happens when the darkness within the church's walls is exposed to the light? In this story of betrayal, survival, and justice, the truth will shake you to your core. This is the story of how one family's silence was broken, and how a town was forced to confront the darkest secret of its most trusted leader. The town of Clearwater was a quiet, unassuming place, nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. It was a place where neighbors greeted each other with a nod and a smile, where life seemed to slow down amidst the peaceful backdrop of nature. At the heart of this town was its church, a towering structure that symbolized the faith that bound the people together. The church wasn't just a building, it was a sanctuary, a place where the community gathered every Sunday to worship, to seek solace, and to be reminded of their shared beliefs. The man who stood at the center of this church was Pastor Samuel Carter, a figure so revered that his name was spoken with the utmost respect. With his commanding presence, Pastor Carter led the congregation through powerful sermons, his deep voice stirring the hearts of everyone who sat in the pews. He was a man of unwavering faith, a man who exuded strength and moral clarity. He was seen as the embodiment of godliness, a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. His wife, Rebecca, stood by his side with quiet grace, her smile warm, her demeanor kind. Their two children, Hannah and Luke, were the picture of innocence and virtue. They were involved in every aspect of the church's activities, from Sunday school to youth group, and their names were often mentioned in the same breath as their fathers. They were the perfect family, a living example of Christian values in a small town that prided itself on its deep-rooted faith. But despite the shining exterior, there was a darkness lurking beneath the surface of the Carter family. Hannah, once a joyful and vibrant teenager, had begun to change. Her radiant smile had faded, replaced by a quiet sadness that seemed to hang over her like a cloud. She withdrew from her friends, no longer engaging in the activities that had once brought her so much joy. Her eyes, once filled with hope, now seemed clouded with a quiet fear that no one could explain. Her younger brother, Luke, was no better. The boy who had once been full of energy and excitement was now withdrawn, lost in his own world, often hiding in his room or in the corners of the church. There was a noticeable tension in the air whenever the Carter family was together. The warmth that once radiated from their home had been replaced by a coldness that no one could ignore. No one except Rebecca, of course. She had noticed it, but she was blind to what it truly meant. She refused to see it for what it was, convincing herself that it was just the stress of growing up or the pressures of church life. But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right, though she couldn't bring herself to confront it. The change was most evident in Hannah. The bright and spirited girl who had once been the heart of the youth group was now distant and cold. She flinched at the slightest touch, her face often pale and drawn. She had become a shell of the person she once was, carrying a heaviness that no one could explain. The emotional distance between her and her father, once a close relationship built on trust and love, had grown. The fear that had taken root in her heart had begun to suffocate her. And Luke, who had always idolized his father, found himself questioning everything he had once believed in. There were moments when he caught his father's cold, calculating gaze, moments that chilled him to the bone. But he couldn't bring himself to speak out, afraid of what would happen if he did. He, too, was trapped in the silent web of fear that their father had carefully woven around them. It wasn't until one night, when the tension finally broke, that the truth came to light. Hannah, her heart pounding in her chest, could no longer keep the secret that had been eating away at her. With trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, she found her mother sitting alone in the living room. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking, "Mom, I can't take it anymore. Daddy, he's been hurting me and Luke. He's been abusing us for so long." Rebecca's face went pale as the words sank in, her heart stopping for a moment. The room seemed to grow colder as Hannah's confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Rebecca's mind raced, unable to comprehend what her daughter was saying. The man she had loved, the man she had devoted herself to, could never be capable of such monstrous actions. But as the truth spilled from Hannah's lips, there was no denying it. The years of bruises, the emotional scars, the fear that had gripped both children, it was all real. Hannah's confession was the spark that ignited a chain of events that could never be undone. With Sarah's encouragement, Hannah found the courage to speak to someone outside her family, someone who would believe her, someone who would help. Sarah, horrified by what she had heard, immediately took action, contacting a local lawyer who specialized in child abuse cases. As Sarah spoke to Luke, she saw the same fear in his eyes that had haunted his sister. He too admitted what had been happening in their home for years. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. Pastor Samuel Carter, the man who had preached love and faith to thousands, was hiding a dark, violent side that he had kept hidden for years. A man who had been trusted by the entire community, who had stood at the pulpit every Sunday and spoken of God's love, had been systematically destroying the lives of his own children. The truth couldn't be hidden any longer. Sarah took the first step, contacting the authorities, and the investigation began. The walls that Pastor Carter had built around his family, his church, and his reputation began to crack. The community that had once seen him as a godly man now had to face the reality that the man they had trusted was capable of unspeakable evil. As the investigation deepened, more and more people came forward with stories of the preacher's manipulation, of the control he had exercised over his family. Those who had once been blind to the truth began to open their eyes. But even as the town turned against him, Pastor Carter remained defiant, using his position as a man of God to try to discredit those who dared speak out against him. He stood in front of his congregation, declaring his innocence, twisting scripture to justify his actions. He had always known how to manipulate the words of the Bible, how to twist them to suit his own needs. He knew how to make people believe in him, even when the truth was staring them in the face. But no matter how much he tried to protect himself, the truth couldn't be hidden any longer. The investigation moved forward, and soon, a court case was set in motion. Pastor Carter was arrested, his crimes exposed for all to see. The man who had once stood as the pillar of the community was now a prisoner, facing charges that would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. The town, once united in faith, was now divided. Some couldn't bring themselves to believe the accusations against him, unable to reconcile the image of the preacher they had known with the man who had been revealed in the courtroom. Others, like Sarah, knew that the truth was the only way forward. The church, once a place of refuge, now stood as a reminder of the pain and betrayal that had occurred within its walls. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to pick up the pieces. Pastor Carter's arrest had sent shockwaves through Clearwater, and for the first time, people began to question the authority that had been placed in one man. Rebecca, devastated by the truth, struggled to come to terms with the man she had loved. She had been blind to his cruelty, believing that the abuse was something she had imagined. But now, with the truth laid bare before her, she was forced to confront the reality of what had happened in her home. The guilt she carried was suffocating, but she knew she had to find a way to make it right, for her children and for herself. Hannah, though scarred by the abuse she had suffered, found the strength to speak out. She began working with local organizations that supported victims of domestic abuse, using her voice to advocate for those who were still trapped in silence. She found healing in helping others, and through this process, she began to rebuild her faith. Luke, too, found solace in the arms of those who loved him. Though the past would always haunt him, he knew that he was no longer trapped. He had a future ahead of him, one that was no longer defined by fear. The Carter family was forever changed. Pastor Samuel Carter's fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. The man who had preached love and faith was now exposed for the monster he truly was. But through the pain, through the loss, there was a sense of hope that began to grow. Hannah and Luke, though scarred by their past, were no longer prisoners of fear. They were free, and in the quiet of the town, as the sun set on the horizon, they began to heal, step by step. As the months passed, Clearwater tried to mend its broken heart. The once vibrant community, where faith had been the very lifeblood, now grappled with the bitter truth of betrayal. The town was split between those who refused to accept that their beloved pastor had fallen so far and those who had finally opened their eyes to the damage caused by his manipulation. But for the Carter children, the world was a far more complicated place now. Their lives had been shattered in ways that no one could truly understand. Hannah, whose spirit had been suffocated for years, had begun to rebuild, but it wasn't easy. The weight of her trauma was a constant companion, following her every step. Yet, with each passing day, she found small ways to heal, small victories that felt monumental. She had begun speaking at local schools, using her experience to shed light on the darkness of abuse and to encourage others to find their voices. Her story, though painful to relive, became her weapon in the fight against the silence that so often protected the abuser. In the process, she found strength she didn't know she had. It was a journey of self-discovery, a path that led her back to the belief that her voice mattered, that she mattered. Luke, too, was on his own journey. His silence had been his shield, but now, with the truth out in the open, he felt as though the shield had been shattered. The boy who once idolized his father had to reconcile the man he had looked up to with the man who had caused him so much pain. He began therapy, his first steps into understanding the emotional damage that had been inflicted on him, and slowly, he began to let go of the fear that had defined his life for so long. It wasn't easy. He often found himself haunted by nightmares, flashes of memories he wished he could forget. But there were moments of clarity, when he realized that he was no longer trapped in his father's grip. He was free, and with that freedom came the responsibility to heal and move forward. He wanted to help others like him, to be a beacon of hope for the silent children who had been suffering for far too long. Rebecca, torn apart by the truth, found herself in a painful limbo. She had always believed in the goodness of her husband, the man who had been her partner in life, the father of her children. But now, that belief felt like a cruel joke. She had been blind, so thoroughly deceived by his charm and authority that she had failed to see the monster lurking behind his smile. The guilt consumed her. She had failed her children, failed to protect them when they needed her most. But as she watched Hannah and Luke begin to heal, she realized that her journey of healing wasn't over. She, too, had to face her own demons. She had to confront the fact that she had allowed herself to be manipulated, that she had ignored the signs in order to maintain the perfect image of family. With the support of her children, she began attending counseling sessions, working through the trauma of her own complicity. It was a painful process, but Rebecca knew it was necessary. She had to become the mother her children needed, not just the one she had been. And then there was the church. The sanctuary that had once been the safe haven for the entire community now stood as a painful reminder of betrayal. The pews, once filled with people eager to hear Pastor Carter's sermons, were now empty, the silence deafening. Some members of the congregation could not bring themselves to believe the truth, unwilling to accept that the man they had trusted had deceived them all. They continued to support Pastor Carter, even as the evidence piled up against him. For these people, the preacher was a symbol of faith, a man who had led them through the darkest times of their lives. They couldn't fathom that he could have been capable of such horrors. But others, like Sarah, stood firm in their belief that the truth had to be faced. Sarah had been the catalyst for the investigation, the one who had refused to remain silent, and now she was the one who fought for the community to heal. She organized support groups for those affected by Pastor Carter's crimes, helping them rebuild their shattered trust in the church. It wasn't easy. Many struggled to separate their love for the church from the betrayal they had experienced. But Sarah remained determined, convinced that healing could only begin when the truth was fully embraced. As the trial of Pastor Samuel Carter moved forward, the town was forced to confront its own role in allowing such a man to hold power for so long. The courtrooms were filled with tension as witnesses took the stand, and Pastor Carter's dark secrets were exposed in full. He sat at the defendant's table, once a proud man who had commanded attention with his every word, now a broken figure, stripped of his dignity. The town watched, some with disbelief, others with quiet satisfaction, as the preacher's fall from grace continued. But for the Carter children, it wasn't about watching their father crumble. It was about reclaiming their own lives. Hannah and Luke had spent years under their father's thumb, suffocated by his lies. Now, they were free to live, free to make choices that were their own. They were free to heal, to rebuild their lives from the ground up. In the end, Pastor Carter was convicted of his crimes. His prison sentence was a small consolation for the damage he had done, but for the children of the Carter family, it was a step toward closure. As the man who had terrorized them for so long was carted away in handcuffs, they knew that their lives would never be the same. But they also knew that they were no longer victims. They were survivors. And that was a truth that no one could take away. The story of the Carter family became a cautionary tale for the town of Clearwater. It was a story of betrayal, of a man who had used his position to manipulate and control, and of children who had found the strength to speak out. It was a story of healing, of rebuilding, and of finding the courage to face the truth. The town, though scarred by the revelations, began to rebuild in its own way. People came together, their faith tested but ultimately strengthened by the trials they had endured. They learned that faith was not just about trusting in someone else, but in trusting themselves, in standing up for what was right, even when the truth was difficult to bear. For Hannah and Luke, the road ahead was still long. But they had each other, and they had the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their pain. Together, they would rebuild their lives, finding solace in the love of those who had supported them through the darkest of times. And in the quiet of Clearwater, the sun began to rise once more, casting a warm glow on a town that had been forever changed, but was now moving toward a new chapter, one filled with healing, hope, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us for this true crime documentary. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on more chilling story true life crime.
Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, so you never miss a story.